Hello, my name is Tom Lewis. I'm the neuroscience part of the Forever Young team. And today we're going to talk just a little bit about the relationship between the brain, longevity, and meditation. Now, meditation is a huge topic, so we won't be covering everything about meditation today because there's a lot to say about the relationship between meditation and longevity. But for today, I would just like to introduce the concept of what meditation is, especially what it is vis-a-vis the brain. To the brain, what is meditation? And then we'll cover some of the more specific aspects of meditation, probably in a future talk. All right, so here we are, ready to talk about meditation. There we go. All right. So if we go all the way back to fundamentals, it helps us to remember that the brain is a physical object. It's a special kind of physical object. Not many things in the universe are like your brain, because your brain is not only pulsing with activity all the time, constantly, but the peculiar thing about the brain, or one of the special things, is that it takes information that comes to it and it uses that information to transform its own internal structure. This is an incredibly rare property of physical objects in the universe. So information comes in, the brain is altered by that information in its own physical structure. Now, even more, this information can come from the outside world into your brain, altering its physical structure. This happens all the time. So literally everything you expose yourself to alters the structure of your brain. That's why you see headlines in the newspaper all the time. Video games alter teenagers' brains. Reading Shakespeare alters people's brains. It has to be that way. It couldn't be any other way. Everything alters the internal structure of your brain. Every piece of information that comes to it, your brain uses that information to alter its own internal structure. One of the things that's very special about the brain is that information that is used to alter the brain can come not only from the outside, but the information can actually come from within the brain itself. So the brain itself can generate information and then use that information to change its own internal structure. This is a really incredibly rare property. You would think, off the top of your head, it might be very important for the brain to make a clear distinction between information that originated from outside the brain and information that originated from inside the brain. In fact, that isn't true. Your brain doesn't care at all, mostly, whether information comes from inside or outside the brain. They're both influential. So the odd circumstance is that if somebody comes up to me on the street and says, "Tom, you're an idiot," that has an effect on the structure of my brain. But if I'm just sitting at home and I think to myself, "Tom, you're an idiot," that has almost exactly the same effect as if someone had said that to me on the street. So that the information coming from within the brain is every bit as influential as information coming from outside the brain. The brain does not make much of an effort to determine whether the information comes from within or without. One of the things that means is, there's a couple of things it means. One is you get to choose what you expose your brain to. And in that sense, you get to choose the future structure of your own brain. So you get to choose what environmental things you expose yourself to. If you expose yourself to, say, watching a certain kind of television show, you'll end up with one kind of brain structure. And if you instead were to read the works of Shakespeare, you would come out with a different brain structure. So you get to choose what you expose your brain to. But of course, you're not in charge of all parts of the external world, so you can't choose everything that comes in and exposes your brain to information. But you do have a really great latitude to choose what kind of internally generated pieces of information you expose your brain to. So your own internally generated thoughts alter your brain structure. If you spend a lot of time telling yourself you're an idiot, that actually changes the structure of your brain. And you have a lot of authority, you have a lot of discretionary power over the activity of your own brain. So in many ways, you can choose the kind of future brain structure you want to have by doing a combination of two things. One, being careful what you expose your brain to from the outside world. Number two, being judicious and careful about what you expose your brain to from the inside world, from your own generated thoughts. And you can kind of see where this is heading in the direction of meditation. So meditation is a certain kind of input that you voluntarily expose your brain to, often with the hope of changing it in some way. And as we'll see, it does in fact change the brain in certain pretty well-defined ways. So if we want to think about meditation in the brain and what it fundamentally is to the brain, and we look to the largest kind of definition we could think of for meditation, I think meditation is a collection of diverse practices that, from the standpoint of your brain, share this, that this family of practices share the habit of redirecting routine narrative thought to focus on something other than narrative thought. So what do I mean by that? Narrative thought, or what I call narrative thought, is, some people call it mind wandering in certain neuroscience papers, particularly imaging papers. That's called default mode network activity. This is the kind of brain activity that happens as you're going about your day when you're customarily thinking either about your own past, your own present, or your own future. When you do any of those things, you're in a narrative thought mode. So as you go through the present, most people experience their life and their present as a story in which they are the protagonist. And they go out and try to achieve certain things, and either they go well or they don't go well. But it appears that the only means we have of representing our conscious experience is through narrative means. So we conceptualize our present as a narrative. When you imagine your past, it becomes a coherent story in which you yourself were the protagonist. When you imagine your future, it's also a narrative, a coherent narrative story in which you're the protagonist. So this narrative thought, or default network activity, constitutes a lot of what your brain usually does. In meditation, people are instructed, when they find themselves in this narrative mode, thinking about their past, thinking about their future, thinking about their current state, they're encouraged to not do that, to not think of those things, and to focus on something else. I think for the brain, it largely doesn't matter what that something else is, just as long as it's not the narrative thought stream, just as long as it's not your own story. And as we'll see in some meditative traditions, people can be instructed to focus on a word, a mantra, instead of their own narrative thoughts. People might be instructed to focus on a sound instead of their own narrative thoughts. People might be instructed to focus on an internal sensation, like the sensation of breath entering or leaving their body, instead of focusing on their own narrative thoughts. People might be instructed to focus on an activity like breathing in a certain way with a certain rhythm, or with a certain emphasis on shortening the inhalation and extending the exhalation phase of breath. People might be instructed to focus on that. These are all effective means of meditation, and the one thing that I think they share in common is the effort to redirect attention away from narrative thought to something else, almost anything else. It almost doesn't matter, as long as you get out of the narrative thought stream. So this person sitting meditating might be thinking of a mantra, might be focusing on a mantra as opposed to her own thought stream and story. She might be focusing on a sound, like the sound of the water falling. She might be focusing on an internal sensation, like the sensation of breathing. She might be focusing on an activity, like the activity of breathing, in order to achieve a meditative state. So here's our brain again. And if we look at what meditation does in the brain, neuroscience is advanced enough, and interest in how meditation affects the brain is advanced enough, that there are now a number of different studies demonstrating that meditation changes the brain. It changes how information is processed in the brain, both on a large scale sense and in a small scale sense. So if you look at the fibrous networks in the brain has these long, essentially network cables that connect one area to another area. It's clear that meditation alters the structural framework of the meditative of the cabling, so that certain parts of the cabling become more efficient than other parts. If we were to zoom in and look at the individual neuronal networks, it's clear that meditation alters the structure of the neuronal networks, making some networks stronger in their information processing capacity and some networks weaker. If we were to zoom in